It is Ababa for Addis. As a show of might in Nairobi, as President William Ruto and regional leaders push for the case of Raila Odinga's candidature for the AU. But what are the odds? We'll do mathematics of a continental scale. And from Addis to the lake, the handshake, strongly denied by the way, is drawing crowds across the Nyanza counties. Beyond the AU, what are Ruto and Raila up to? We have 14 questions. And talking of 14, it is the 14th anniversary week for the Constitution of Kenya 2010. Happy birthday, Katiba. On my take tonight, we can't be happy about enforced disappearances and abductions. On Jamila's memo, the cost of lying. Lessons from the United Kingdom. On Sam Sense, do austerity measures really make sense? Advisors and homecoming parties down the road. On Kai Kai's kicker, how about an audit of what corruption really costs us? News Gang is here.
I know that Honorable Raila not only possesses the requisite credentials, but he is also the ideal candidate to lead the Africa Union Commission. Accordingly, Kenya endorses his candidature unreservedly, and we commit wholeheartedly to support his candidature, his vision, and his leadership. He embodies extensive experience and a deep understanding of both African affairs and global dynamics.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to News Gang. It's good to be back here again. The hashtag is News Gang at Citizen TV Kenya. So, what a show of might, at least for the East African region, this week has been. Sam, heads of state, prime ministers, envoys, ambassadors, everyone from all sides of the political divide were gathered at State House. Kenya playing host to quite the big leadership, quite the big entourage of leadership from the East African region.
Right. And I think the significance of that moment cannot be lost, especially when you look at the political side of things, whether it's local or within the East African region, but also what it means. Remember that just under 2 years ago, the president was competing against Raila Odinga in the 2022 general election for the presidency. And if you may recall, a few months before that election, there's a time that during the final, actually it was a few days to the election, during the final rallies, that you heard Raila Odinga saying that he would shake the hand of the opponent, whether he wins or he loses the election. And obviously, you will recall the events that followed after that, that eventually culminated to what we've seen the past few weeks and months, especially coming out of the broad-based government. So the meeting at State House yesterday, seeing those different heads of state, I think there were three. We're talking about the president of Tanzania, president of Uganda, president of South Sudan, and obviously the fourth one being the president of the Republic of Kenya. And in attendance, the Prime Minister of Burundi and the Foreign Affairs Minister from Rwanda. That significance, you will see the very first time we're seeing a candidate from Kenya for the AUC position having such kind of an unveiling. Because if you recall, back when Amina Mohammed, the then cabinet secretary, was she in the Foreign Affairs Department? Mm-hmm. That time when she had moved. The launching, or rather the unveiling of her candidature was not in the same magnitude as what we saw at State House. So I think also the president obviously trying to make the bid for Raila Odinga to position him, as he said, the candidate from East Africa for Africa. And then again looking at the implication back at home, because the past few weeks have meant something, at least for President William Ruto in his grip on different corners of the country. So again, he was speaking to the supporters of Raila Odinga as he was speaking to the supporters of William Ruto moving forward. And what a coincidence that immediately after that unveiling, then you see the tours that you've seen in Nyanza. Of course, the president, accompanied by some of the cabinet secretaries that have come from the side of ODM, going to Nyanza region. And if you have to look at even the few events that led to that event at State House on Tuesday, you will recall that days before, Raila Odinga just indicated that he's going to also exit the national stage, the political stage in the country, going for now the AU job. So for me, I think seeing the different leaders there, listening to Raila Odinga make his speech, listening to him trying to endear himself to the entire continent, giving examples of even him being the Lion of Africa, and giving the examples, is it Senegal, and the different African countries whose national football teams carry the name Simba. Yeah. I think that was quite significant moving ahead. Yeah, but it's also interesting what you said about, and we can listen as well in just a few seconds to the Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua, also, praising him. And we'll come back and talk about the significance of all of this, because there's local politics at play, and maybe there's some who imagine that after all that razzmatazz, that this is it, but there's a long road ahead. But you know what you've talked about, and what we're saying, a handshake. It's rather interesting to see this, at least from a local perspective, unfolding. This is what the Deputy President had to say about Raila Odinga's candidature.
I therefore want to say, Your Excellency, the lessons of today are that Raila Odinga, the Right Honorable, is a man of great resilience, endurance, and perseverance. Today, you are going to unveil the transformation of the Right Honorable Odinga from a national leader to an African statesman.
And there we have it. So we'll come back and hear from himself as well. But even before we get there and get an understanding of the road ahead and what that looks like and the dynamics involved, I mean, this is just step one, Jamila, isn't it? Yes. There's a lot more that happens, and it's a lot more than just an East African affair, even though that's what we saw with the launch that took place this week. They're not the only ones who are going to be making this decision as to who leads the AU Commission.
That's right, Yvonne. In fact, the next step for Raila now is to officially kick off his campaign, and he's expected to do that next month in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which of course is the headquarters of the AU. And then now we have the elections that are going to come up in February 2025, which is the 38th AU Summit, which will also be held in Addis Ababa. And as we've said, the AUC chairperson is elected by the Assembly for a 4-year term, which is renewable once. And that's what Musa Faki, the outgoing chair of the commission, is from Chad. He has served his 2 4-year terms. Now, He's exiting the scene. And other than the elections of the chairperson, of course, we'll have the elections of the deputy chairperson and also commissioners. And all those together make up the commission's top leadership. And Yvonne, as you mentioned, the African Union is classified into 5 regions. And it's important that people understand that it's not yet in the bag for Raila Odinga. We have the Southern, we have the Central, we have the Eastern, we have the Western, and the Northern Africa. And in 2018, the AU introduced some rules that said that the seat of the AUC chairperson will be held on a rotational basis among these regions. And then this year in March, the African Union Executive Council meeting ratified the recommendations by its Permanent Representatives Committee, which allowed the Eastern region to be eligible to nominate candidates for the position of the chairperson, while Northern Africa region was given the eligibility to nominate candidates for the position of deputy chairperson. So already that's what we're looking at. In fact, if you look at the 4 candidates who've already put their names in the hat, there's, of course, Raila Odinga from Kenya. There's Mahmoud Ali Yusuf of Djibouti. We have Ali Gayan from Mauritania and Richard Randria Mandrato of Madagascar. And one thing you notice from these four gentlemen, Yvonne, is that they've either been maybe a prime minister or foreign affairs minister. There's a certain caliber of leadership that is required for one to be eligible to run for the chairperson of the African Union Commission. And Yvonne, they have rules within which these elections are held. It talks about how the elections will be. It talks about how one to win needs to have 2/3 majority. It talks about how, like right now, if you look at the situation in Africa, Yvonne, we have several countries, I think there are about 6, who have been suspended from the AU and who cannot vote during this election. That's Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Gabon, and Sudan. This may change come January, but as of now, for one person to be declared the ultimate winner in this election, they need 33 countries to vote for them. So tuangalie East Africa, tuangalie South, tuangalie North, tuangalie all those regions. So Raila Odinga has to woo 33 countries to vote for him. And you know, if you look at the last elections for Moussa Faki, I think they went up to 7 rounds before you actually get the person who gets the ultimate 2/3. And in fact, according to the rules, if no one gets 2/3 by the time Obakiana candidate Moja, because you know there's an elimination process that will happen, the chairman will suspend the elections. The newly elected deputy chairperson will run the affairs of the AU Commission until such a date that the new elections will be conducted. So there is not really any vacuum. Yes, there has to be a winner, but even if there isn't one, there is, of course, mechanisms for that. So the campaigns are just starting.
Yeah, and the vote takes place
in Addis Ababa in February 2025 during the 38th summit of AU. So campaign zimeanza. Make sure you have East Africa yote in your back pocket, but remember now you have all the other candidates from Eastern Africa also. Ambao tafuta ungwaji mkono nyumbani kwanza.
Right. So, and there seems to be a sense in which, and you know, the excitement is all well and good because of, you know, quite the show and the spectacle that we saw yesterday. But this is far from a local issue.
Absolutely. And State House did put up a major show. And remember, there were hitches at some point. There was that video that was supposed to introduce Raila Odinga to the room. And the choreography was quite detailed. You saw how the presidents that were invited were seated first before now the candidate, Raila Odinga, is introduced. The video could not play. And you know, at some point I expected it to contain or a banner saying Raila the 5th. And why? Because if elected, he'll be the 5th African Union Commission chairman since the new arrangement came to place. But back to the question of local. This is just good optics because the tough job is yet to start. And the tough work now is to get to the diplomatic space and campaign and convince states to cast their vote in the direction of Raila Odinga. And one of the things that should really inform Kenyans when they are watching these events of Addis Ababa is just remember the election that was contested by former Foreign Affairs Minister, former Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary Amina Mohammed, where she leads in the first 2 rounds of the election. I think at some point it was 17-16, and then it moved to 27-26. And then the game changed after that. And after that, she actually lost. And President Uhuru Kenyatta, who had staked so much into the race, was actually among the first presidents to leave Addis Ababa when that vote finally was taken, and showing that Moussa Faki had been elected the chairperson. If Raila Odinga is elected, he'll only be the second candidate from the English-speaking Africa, which we'll talk about. It's a big deal, what language people speak, what foreign language people speak.
Interesting,
we have to actually specify.
That's right, yeah.
Because the first president, Alpha Omar Konare, who was a former president of Mali, and then former prime minister of Gabon, Jean Ping, was the second chairperson. The third chairperson was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma from South Africa. And then now Moussa Faki becomes the 4th. And then now the election will be for the 5th. One thing that you can pick right away that is different about Raila Odinga compared to the previous occupants. All previous occupants were actually foreign affairs ministers at some point, except for President Alpha Umar Konare, who was former president. The rest, Jinping was foreign affairs in Gabon. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was foreign affairs minister. And also, the current chairperson was not just former foreign affairs minister, but actually at some point was prime minister of the Republic of Chad. So there are a lot of other factors now. Yeah. In fact, the difficult job begins. The tough part of this whole thing begins. I think a lot of effort has been put into providing local optics for this. Yes. And we shall talk about that. Yeah. Remember, not a single local except President William Ruto will be taking a vote in the Addis.
But you know, it's interesting that we mention Amina Mohamed's candidature and you know how that went in terms of the votes and the numbers. But Linus, what didn't go right? How did Amina Mohamed lose that election in that seat? And so what do we need to do better, differently now? Because it also felt like it was perhaps not a launch, at least to this scale that we have seen with heads of state being invited, but it really was the shuttle diplomacy that we saw. Is Kenya a heavyweight in the diplomatic space on the continent that can then make this work a second time around? So what happened then, and how do we avoid that now if we want to win?
It's a straightforward one. She lost this on the diplomatic weighing scale. She just was lighter than Musa Faki. And the reason is countries vote along the lines of interests. And interests are complex. They are many. It's not about affinity. It's not about bring your most loved politician, for example. It wouldn't matter. There are a lot of factors at play at the AU. And it should be remembered that in the last vote, the last round of the vote, Kenya was actually abandoned. Amina Mohamed was abandoned by regional nations that included Djibouti, Tanzania, and I think Burundi. They all voted the other way. And why is that? It's because there are very complex national and international interests at play. And I really hope the same mistakes are not repeated in the part of Kenya when it comes to how the positioning of the Raila Odinga candidature is placed. First of all, it's completely misleading to keep projecting the local angle of this, because the AU will not care that you are fixing handshake politics back home at all. They're not looking at that. People are looking at very, very complex affairs. For example, we had earlier on referred to the language divide. It's not just about language, but it's about certain ideological positionings and diplomatic ties that countries build out there. The French-speaking Africa, for example, until recently, was very tight with France. And by being tight with France, there is another dotted line to the European Union. Others now, for example, the Maghreb line, where we have, not the Maghreb, but this Sahel region, where we have Niger, we have Mali and Burkina Faso, all countries that are currently under military rule. Guess who they'll listen to? It'll be Russia, because Russia is working with them. There'll be nations that will also listen to what is China saying. And of course, our usual suspects. Where does the United States stand? For a very long time, it should be remembered that the US had Djibouti as a very strategic base. And of course, we are also told now we are the closest non-NATO
major non-NATO ally.
Major non-NATO ally. So there are all these factors that will come to play, and what your friends feel and what your friends think will also matter. So there are all these non-voting countries that will have a voice there. In the last election, for example, Morocco, which had not been readmitted to the AU, had a big voice. And Morocco had a big voice because of the Sahrawi Republic issue.
And
now, we have a little complication. We have a little complication. I don't know whether we fixed it somehow. But during the inauguration of President William Ruto, we hosted the Sahrawi president. Yeah. And I remember the announcement going out that, the Sahrawi president is here, and he joins the rest of the heads of state. No, those are things that don't make Morocco smile. And I don't know whether they forgave that. And if they haven't, what kind of message will they be sending to countries that are friendly to it at the African Union? So there are very complex geopolitical issues that will be at play. So the earlier the local excitement is shut down and the country concentrates on the complex space of diplomacy, where we need to have our titans playing ball in terms of going to those capitals and convincing not just the president, but also the minister of foreign affairs. Yeah. I see we have formed a small team of 2. Is it? I saw the president announcing that it'll be the PS for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Korir Singwe, and former Ambassador Elkanah Odembo. A lot of work for them. They really have to press that phone. And those handshakes, diplomatic handshakes, take a lot of those juices that diplomats take out there and win the trust, convince them that, that Kenya is a safe pair of hands. And this is my last point on this. The candidature normally, as much as you have a candidate, is also seen as a country. Yeah. So it's Kenya holding the chairmanship of that. So the totality of Kenya is looked at. The totality of its foreign policy, its relations with others, handling certain positionings on others. For example, I'm sure Somalia, which mysteriously did not turn up in State House, maybe they are thinking, I'm just speculating here. I remember we were saying direct flights to Hargeisa. I don't mean to attack you, Jamila, where you are. Yeah, but yes. And then there was, I think, a little matter of, did the president name somebody?
We had a former Somalia deputy prime minister and foreign minister.
No, did you name somebody to be in the consular office?
Yes,
somebody? Somebody. All those things are normally interpreted very, very closely. Yeah. Mogadishu wouldn't be excited about any country that tries to say Hargeisa, to raise the status of Hargeisa. So there are all these things. It'll come down to actually, when we were playing football some time back, you stepped on my toes.
Yes, that's interesting because Sam had also mentioned, his speech. I want us to listen to that and all the sort of, analogy there, and whether we're starting to see him crafting a narrative or see them crafting a narrative around him about a lion. And I know for Kenyans, you think Simba, but hang on, he did talk of lions of Teranga and that sort of thing. Let's listen to the case that Raila made for his own candidature.
The lion is an African animal. It's a king of the jungle. The Cameroonian national soccer team is called the Indomitable Lions. The soccer team of Senegal is called the Lions of Teranga. The soccer team of Morocco is called the Atlas Lions. Here in Eastern Africa, we call it the Simba. The king of the jungle. When the king roars, the jungle listens.
Is the jungle listening to the roar? And I think, like we've said, Sam, here, this is definitely politics and dynamics on a different scale and on a different level. And in as much as there's much excitement, we have a couple of months yet to seeing how this unfolds and what happens. So,
Right.
There is that there, and we'll come back and talk about the local politics that apparently this is.
Yeah, he made quite a case there. Yeah. Of course, defining a candidate for Africa, which is not an easy job because you're coming from the background of the leader of the opposition in the country. And if you're to even reflect the previous many months that we've had in this country and how Raila Odinga has conducted his politics, it tells you a lot now with the benefit of the hindsight that it was not just a coincidence. Like, he was very calculative even when people are speaking against what the government was proposing, whether it is the questions of the finance bill. If even to reflect on immediately the announcement was made that Raila Odinga was going for the AUC job, I think it was early in the year, you will see a candidate who was now transforming in how he addressed issues in the country, speaking the voice of the people sometimes, but also trying to sort of call for calm, whether it is on the podium or when speaking to the political party, as it were, behind the scenes. So when you are to even imagine what exactly happened during the Gen Z demonstrations, during the conversation about the finance bill, and here is a man who was not as vocal as he was when we were talking about the finance bill of 2023 during those times that there were demonstrations across the country. So you will see a very deliberate transformation, and you will see the reason being that you cannot be a person who is causing trouble in your domestic or at your home, but at the same time you are seeking to lead the continent. So really, that was important to build his profile so that when he's coming to the people of Africa and telling them that I want to be your chairperson in the very important organ, which is the Secretariat of the African Union, he needed to have that behind him. And even if you look at the election of Amina, or rather the election that she lost in 2017, I think, the lobbying continued up until the day of the election, because yes, you'll do the diplomacy, the trips that will have to be made to different capitals in Africa, but even on the day of the election, the lobbying will still be going on. If you are to read even the articles that were written that time about that election, you see how confident Team Kenya was getting into the moment of the election. So really, we'll be waiting to see, because also that sounds like it's a serious budget to really support candidate Raila. And I was speaking to someone not long ago, and they were indicating that it could be into the hundreds of millions of shillings in supporting that campaign. So you can only imagine what is going to happen in the coming months.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is also what Linus was saying about what this also means for Kenya. And if you remember what President William Ruto's stance has been in terms of trying to fashion himself as a Pan-Africanist, a Pan-African leader, you remember those very early speeches early in his administration, one that he made in Midrand, South Africa, where he started to talk about how we trade in Africa, and talking about, you know, the global financial architecture system that is unfair to those in the global south, particularly those in Africa. Look at the efforts that he made with hosting the Africa Climate Summit last year and pushing for a common African position at the next COP meeting that's happening towards the end of this year. And so this will also be, you know, a boost for him in terms of, you know, his quest in that regard, and perhaps positioning Kenya there. And you would have to wonder then, you know, what sort of also local issues that he would need to sort of quickly sort out, matters like the protests and that sort of thing, so that Kenya looks like she is in charge of her affairs before presenting a candidate to be able to lead Africa, you know, in Addis. And I suppose there's, you know, also the little politics of, you know, leaders and how are you doing in your country and what's this and, you know, what's happening. Perhaps to some extent and some degree, that you have to ensure that your own legitimacy as a head of state is secure before you call other heads of state to your country and say, hey, President Samia Suluhu, hello, President Yoweri Museveni, President Salva Kiir, I'm calling you here to support my candidate or the Kenyan candidate. Then, you know, you sort of have to look like you are a country that is sort of in charge of its own affairs before you start presenting a candidate for this. So there might be an aspect of this where looking at Kenya, but also looking at the president's Pan-Africanist agenda, certainly with someone at the AU, a Kenyan at the AUC, then, you know, it does put him in good stead to start to push some of his regional and continental agenda.
Yvonne, if you talk about that Pan-Africanism that President Ruto has been trying to cultivate, reminds me of the declaration that Kenya was going to be a visa-free country by the beginning of 2024. But then now that really did not really happen as he would have wished, because we still have anyone visiting Kenya having to apply for electronic travel authorization, but at a cost. In fact, other countries where people would travel to, other than, of course, the East African countries, other countries that before Kenya, people would travel to Kenya without having to have a visa or pay for a visa or anything like that, are now having to pay the $30 that they were. Then reminds me of what Raila Odinga said yesterday in his speech, because one of the things he talked about prioritizing was the rolling out of a continental visa if he's elected. But then now that would mean a lot, because what he spoke about yesterday, of course, I'm sure all these countries are listening to what he's saying, wanachambua, anasema amesema hivi na vile. The visa thing actually stood out for me because of other attempts in the past to have something close to that have not really succeeded, Yvonne, because in 2018, there has been they had launched what they're calling the African Union passport, whose holders would face less restrictions while traveling within the continent, but that never picked up. There are a lot of delays in processing passport and visas, especially in our country. There are countries where it's easier for them, but here in Kenya, that's an issue. And then you're looking at now, of course, kuna shida ya kusafiri in Africa. I remember he quoted what Aliko Dangote said, that he needs 35 visas to travel in Africa, where his French competitor does not need a visa to travel with a French passport in Africa. And he talked about the Schengen visa, where you use one visa, you travel to all these countries. But the point is this now, what he has said in his speech yesterday also is very important in terms of what it means for other countries in the continent and what their vote for him would mean, considering what he's promising to implement or start or you know, vitu ambavyo atafanya akichaguliwa. And lastly, Yvonne, I was looking at what the job, so unajua ukienda kutafuta kazi kuna ile kazi imetumwa, ndo hii kazi. These are the roles, responsibilities, qualifications, vitu kama hizo. And it says the chairperson of the African Union Commission is the chief executive officer, legal representative of the union, and the accounting officer of the union. The chairperson of the commission is a transformative leadership role responsible for driving the performance of the AU Commission in delivering the continental vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. The chairperson is directly responsible to the Executive Council for the discharge of his or her duties. The chairperson of the Commission shall have a high commitment to Pan-African values and the guiding principles of the African Union. That's just in summary what this job means. And I think it's something that Raila Odinga and all those who are running his campaign need to keep in mind in terms of what exactly is the messaging going forward. This is what we're going to tell them. This is what we're going to use. This is what we're going to say. Kujaribu kuconvince watu watupigie kura. Because this is no longer local politics ile ya kuahidi hapo hivyo. This is more on a continental basis, and the stakes are much higher if you look at what exactly this role means.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about just the local and the excitement that has garnered? Okay, well and good. There's also, you know, certain local politics at play, but Linus, are we justified to be this excited about this candidature? And I think there's lots of also, you know, local politics that is at play that we are thinking about, and there's a way in which it is being presented locally. Now at least we've gotten the understanding of what this means on the African continent, and to just understand that, hey, you know, this is a much bigger campaign and much bigger forces and dynamics at play. But here we are locally, perhaps in some ways using it to interpret, or maybe to imagine that it would solve some of the local politics that we've had. In any way possible? No?
I think that is, if it's looked at strictly from the point of view of Raila Odinga's place in national politics, in local politics. And there are those who are seeing it entirely that way, that, okay, here is President William Ruto's closest challenger in the 2022 election. Here is a man who enjoys quite some following locally. He can conduct a rally anytime, and there'll be thousands of supporters coming his way. And now he is going to be out of the way. There are those who are looking at this as more as a consummation of benefits of the handshake. But it really should be pointed out that diplomacy is actually a specialist space, and it's actually not meant for crowds. There's no place for rallies in it. It's a very sophisticated environment, and shortly the local element of crowds and cheering about the candidate going to Addis will have to die down, and the real complex work of talking about interests of nations.
I mean, he will disappear from the local scene once his campaign well and truly begins. I mean, if he's got to campaign in Africa,
it will actually be physically impossible. Right. It should be physically impossible to find him in Kibra. Yeah. It should be physically impossible to find him in any of these local places.
The homecomings,
Jacaranda grounds. I mean, he's not in the homecomings, and for example, in Homa Bay, he would have been in a typical local moment. He would be the star of the ongoing rallies in Nyanza, but now he needs to be in those halls of diplomatic lobbying to assure countries that he's a good candidate.
Does he have that ability, Linus? Because and especially for those who have, if you've interviewed Raila Odinga, you know that he comes alive much more when he's at a podium and there is crowds and masses, and that's where, his forte plays out. When you interview him or sit in a one-on-one, his demeanor is somewhat slightly different. And what you were saying about, how he will have to conduct his campaigns in the diplomatic circles and spaces, this will require, obviously, a different, rejigging. It can't be the, hey, watu mnasemaje? And then the crowd goes wild.
Actually not much rejigging considering his experience. I mean, he's not a young man. He's a very, very experienced politician who was a former prime minister. He's also a person who built personal ties with some of his eminent people in Africa. I mean, Olusegun Obasanjo, who wrote his the introduction in his book, is a personal friend. So is Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa. He's built his own contacts, and I think that should come to count. But here is one thing that maybe he needs to watch. And I was listening to his African lion analogy. And, African lion is rising and the Asian tiger will have to retreat, and the European bear will have to... this is Pan-African rhetoric. In a globe that is more into building partnerships and alliances, it's not an us versus them game. And normally the first fear in the diplomatic space is champions of us versus them. And I think that should maybe, it was very, very good, again, for our local audience that, we are sending a lion to Addis. But how comfortable would the EU be? How comfortable with the Asian tigers? I know these are analogies, but there's something about that pains an us versus them scenarios. And you know very well, as some can actually talk to us about on the issue of trade imbalances and the sensitivities that attend to international trade. It is a space of negotiations, polite language, telling a country to go to hell, and they do it.
In the most diplomatic language.
The most diplomatic language. So there's a lot of work. I don't want to really underrate what is facing Kenya in the next few months. Remember, Amina Mohamed was straight from Foreign Affairs. and you know, the demeanor naturally for, I mean, Amina is a natural diplomat,
yeah.
you know, very polite, gentle lady, and soft-spoken, non-threatening, you know, a natural choice for such things. Where if you, because you should be non-threatening, you should be able to reach out, you should be approachable and all that. So there's a lot of those things, and I'm really looking forward to what Dr. Korir Singwe and Elkanah Odembo will, for example, be saying in the coming days. But it's also not, diplomacy is not about pleading and looking CC and helpless. You have to be firm, communicate in a confident way. So it's not a Raila Odinga thing alone.
Yeah.
President William Ruto himself, who you know was kept here by Gen Z protests for more than 2 months. I'm very sure he would have done a number of capitals in terms of visits.
We could see him do that now.
Yes, remember he was the campaigner during Amina Mohammed's
That's right, yeah.
campaign.
Yeah.
That's actually the genesis of the Hustler Jet.
That's
yes. It was hopping from one capital to another, to try and get this vote. So we would expect that in the coming days. Now the president has resumed the airspace, I think. He went to Rwanda the other day. So maybe the second trip will be about convincing 1 or 2 other countries to come on board. And I think the red flags to watch is the usual divide of French-speaking versus English-speaking versus Anglophone countries. And don't underrate any candidate. Not even the one whose name is quite difficult to pronounce from...
Please, could you give us we need to get
Jamila got it really right.
Jamila.
And how many letters were those?
Hey, Richard Brandria Mandrato, yes, Madagascar.
Yes. Yeah, Madagascar have like 15 letters.
Actually, that's one of the shortest names in Madagascar, and I think they've done Africa a favor to present that as a candidate. So you can't underrate any candidate because it comes down to what is our safe bet for national interest. Lastly, don't trust everyone that was in the room in State House. I don't think I want to go beyond that.
We learned that the hard way with Amina Mohammed's candidature. Let's take a break. When we come back, we will now talk about what's happening on the local front. There's been quite some campaign. It's homecoming time once again in the country. What's happening there? What's going on? What are the tones and undertones and handshake and warm reception and the usual goodies, the broad-based arrangement and what that means from everyone in the region and indeed in the country. This is News Gang. We'll be right back.